Breaking news into CBS Sports HQ. Alabama All-American linebacker Dylan Moses suffered a torn ACL in practice last night. That's according to multiple reports. The loss of the touted NFL prospect is another blow to the Bama linebacking core. Josh McMillan already injured, and Terrell Lewis will be suspended for at least the first half of their opener against Duke. Moses is ranked number 14 overall on the CBS draft analyst Ryan Wilson's big board. All right, let's bring in Barrett Sallee, writes about college football for us here at CBS. So, Barrett, what's your reaction here? What does this mean for Alabama just 3 days before their opener?
It's absolutely enormous, Casey. I think the general consensus for people outside of Tuscaloosa is that, oh, well, no big deal. They're going to trot out another five-star. And that's just not the case. Dylan Moses, a big part of this rebuilding effort of this defense, a superstar for the last couple of seasons with the Crimson Tide, and the unquestioned leader for not just the defense, but the entire Alabama roster. So it's huge. Like you mentioned, a top-tier draft pick coming up in the draft this year. And in the middle of that linebacking core, you already lost Joshua McMillan to a season-ending injury, like you said. So now you're counting on guys like Shane Lee and Markel Benton and guys who have not played at all. And even if you do want to shift somebody in to that very important quarterback of the defense role, it's somebody who hadn't done it before. So for Alabama, I mean, you couldn't ask for a worse injury to happen, and that includes Tua Tagovailoa, because Mac Jones is a pretty good quarterback. There's nobody with experience and with the trust of Nick Saban behind Dylan Moses. So in terms of brutal injuries, I literally could not script one worse for Alabama.
Wow, that's a big statement from you. And Dylan Moses has played a big role. I mean, he was their leading tackler last year. Nick Saban sort of called on him to rally the troops, so to speak, after that loss to Clemson in the national title game. We know about on the field, but what does this do for that locker room emotionally?
Well, it deflates them. I mean, it's like you said, he was a big part of this rebuilding effort. The defense was broken last year. Tosh Lupoy, the former defensive coordinator, was not prepared from an X's and O's standpoint. So now you have Pete Golding in, but you have Dylan Moses almost working as a co-defensive coordinator because he recognized the problem from Tosh Lupoy, and he's a big part of fixing that problem from Tosh Lupoy because, like we said, he's the quarterback of the defense. He's the guy that throughout the course of the entire offseason on the field was who everybody was looking towards in terms of transitioning to this new Pete Golding defense. So, it's one of those things, man. Off the field, his impact might have been greater than it was on the field, and that's saying an awful lot.
We think back to 2017 when they had a similar attrition there in the linebacking core, and they're going to try to navigate this schedule, right? And so back in 2017, as we said, some attrition. They were able to navigate the end. They lost to Auburn, but they still got to the playoff. What do you think they can learn from 2 years ago that they can apply here to 2019 in this schedule?
That they better get these guys ready for those first two games, Duke and New Mexico State, because South Carolina, they can play a little bit. They've got some weapons, and then throughout that schedule, you're going to have some speed bumps. It might not be like last year where you cruised to 30-point victories because, like you said, 2 years ago they lost Terrell Lewis, they lost Mac Wilson, they lost Christian Miller, and Dylan Moses was the guy at the end of the season who kind of stepped up and became that star. Now, they got a lot of those guys back in the playoff, but that was a big reason they struggled against Mississippi State that year. That was a big reason they lost to Auburn, and it just so happened the door swung open for them to get to the playoff. You can't count on that happening every single year. So you better hope some of these youngsters, some of these inexperienced players get right in a hurry. You got to use the Duke game for that. You got to get them right for South Carolina because that's a tough trip to Williams-Brice Stadium. It'll be all jacked up and really pumped to see that Alabama Crimson Tide there. So, it's tough. They know that lesson from 2017. The problem is they don't have another Dylan Moses to step in. Dylan Moses was that guy, and we all heard about him, a super recruit, and played a pretty solid role as a reserve. There really isn't that guy right now for Alabama.
Yeah, it's even at Alabama, which is just crazy to think. You're right. Dylan Moses, we heard about him from like 8th grade, right? Went to IMG Academy, the whole deal, 5-star recruit. So the injuries are piling up. Josh McMillan, another linebacker with the knee. Obviously, Dylan Moses, a little more impactful there. You are knee-deep here in the SEC for us here at CBS. Bottom line, what school in the SEC benefits the most from Alabama with the attrition they're experiencing?
Texas A&M, bar none. Texas A&M, because they have an offensive genius as their head coach in Jimbo Fisher, and one of the better quarterbacks in the entire country in Kellen Mond. And so when you look at Texas A&M, when they're going to look at this Alabama team, Jimbo Fisher can create matchup problems. Jimbo Fisher can figure out how to get a receiver on a linebacker, or just how to scheme and how to use motion and eye candy to confuse an Alabama linebacking core that still will be relatively inexperienced when they play. So I always thought Texas A&M was the biggest threat to Alabama in the SEC West. They were last year. I think with Mond's growth, they were going to be that anyway this year. Plus, they get Alabama in College Station. So to me, Texas A&M is the one team looking at this going, wow, maybe the Crimson Tide really are susceptible this year. They've done it before. They were pretty tough against Alabama last year. They played them tough when they first got into the SEC, and it wouldn't surprise me if A&M puts Alabama to the brink of disaster in 2019.
All right, and finally, Barrett, we're all about sports betting here on CBS Sports HQ, of course. The win total for Alabama, 11.5 as of now, same as Clemson, highest in the country. Before the Vegas odds makers get their hands on this, do you think I should go and put a bet on the under here, under 11.5?
I wouldn't shy away from it. Now, for the record, 11.5, I would shy away from that bet going over every single time, even though Alabama ran the table in the regular season, because you don't want to bet on perfection. But yeah, I mean, when you have a glaring hole across an entire unit, and they do right now, then yeah, an upset I think is certainly pretty darn likely. I don't know where it's going to come from, but if you're talking about 12 regular season games, when every single coach knows that this is a problem, and they're going to have tape on how other teams attack that problem, you're going to have some pretty close games. So I wouldn't be opposed to going under that 11.5 right now, as long as you can get it. You know how Vegas likes to take things off the board pretty quickly.
Yes, they do. All right, that's our Barrett Sallee after a major blow for Alabama, the leader of their defense, down with an ACL tear. Thanks, Barrett. So that leader, Dylan Moses, and as we spoke with Barrett, he is a highly touted prospect coming out of high school, and he's lived up to it in college. First team selection for the preseason AP All-American team this year. That junior year will not be for Dylan Moses. Breaking news into CBS Sports HQ. Alabama All-American linebacker Dylan Moses suffered a torn ACL in practice last night, according to multiple reports. The loss of the touted NFL prospect represents another blow for the Alabama linebacking core. Josh McMillan already injured, and Terrell Lewis will be suspended at least the first half of their opener against Duke. Moses, ranked number 14 overall in CBS draft analyst Ryan Wilson's big board. And speaking of Ryan Wilson, here he is, draft analyst for us here at CBS. So Ryan, what's your reaction here? How much, if at all, does this hurt Moses' draft stock?
Well, that's the thing. We'll have to wait and see what happens with the surgery and what he decides to do in terms of whether he declares to the draft in the spring or not, or whether he decides to come back. But so he's torn the ACL now in late August. It's an 8 or 9 month recovery, best case. Sometimes 12 months it takes to get back to where you feel comfortable playing. So that brings us to just to the start of the 2020 NFL season. I don't know what Moses is thinking. I have no idea. But I'm sure he'll go through the rehab process early on, get an idea 3 or 4 months in where he feels like he is, and he can perhaps make a decision from there. But if he comes back to Alabama, he will continue to be one of the best players in college football and one of the highly touted players to come into the draft. It gets a little sticky if he declares, Casey, for next draft, for the draft in the spring, because we saw with Jeffrey Simmons, who tore his ACL out of Mississippi State. He tore it in February, 2 months before. He went late in the first round. He was a top 5 talent. Dylan Moses is a top 15 player right now, the best linebacker in college football, the number 1 linebacker in this draft class, were he healthy. So there's some extenuating circumstances, some things that he has to figure out health-wise, what that means for him with an ACL. And I will say this, an ACL in this day and age, you come back from and you can be 100% and be fine. Is there a fear of re-tearing the ACL? Sure, but every player has that possibility playing a game of football. We saw it with Lamar Miller just last week, Jimmy GQ last season, early on in his career. He's back now. So a lot of decisions to be made for Dylan Moses and his camp, but right now, first things first, he's got to have surgery and get through that rehab process and see where he's going to be at.
You called him the number 1 linebacker in college just now, top 15 talent. Who does he remind you of in the pros? I know a lot of people are really excited to see this junior season. What's the NFL comp for Moses?
Well, we've seen the evolution of the inside linebacker in recent years to be more speed, along with strength and physical style play. He's 6'3", 235, and he's actually a couple inches taller than Devin White and Devin Bush, the two linebackers that went top 10 last year. Weighs about the same. We'd have to see what he would run. Those guys ran in the 4.4s. He is that type of talent, but bigger. So if you can wrap your brain around that, he's a sideline-to-sideline guy. He can play in coverage. He dominates behind the line of scrimmage. Listen, he played last year with Mack Wilson, who came into the 2018 season, as a first-round talent. Dylan Moses outplayed Mack Wilson last year. And if Dylan Moses had come into the draft last year, he would have been a first-round pick. Mack Wilson ended up lasting until round 5. So he's a part of this new breed, young, big, fast inside linebacker that can cover players. These inside linebackers can't play zone coverage anymore. They have to be man-to-man guys. Dylan Moses is that, and he's also a terror behind the line of scrimmage. So, again, it's just about him getting healthy and figuring out what he wants to do. But this guy is a outrageous talent. It is hard to see him go down just before the season starts.
I want to go back to overcoming this injury because you brought up a couple of sort of contemporary NFL examples like Jimmy Garoppolo. What about at that position? Because I know Jalen Smith comes to mind. He tore an ACL and had nerve damage. He was supposed to be a top 5 talent. He's obviously worked his way back. Does Moses have that kind of talent and ability to have a productive NFL career?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a good comp there with Jalen Smith. He tore his ACL in that bowl game in January, was drafted that April in the 2nd round. So again, there is time, much more time now for Dylan Moses than there was for the other players we talked about, and he can come back 100%. We've seen Jalen Smith have a fantastic career. He just signed that new deal, was ecstatic about it, well earned. Jerry Jones couldn't say enough good things about him. So if anything, time is on Dylan Moses' side, but it's just a matter of whether, as a junior, he wants to come back for one more season, or whether he wants to push all the chips in and go turn NFL in the spring. But he'll be ready to go a year from now. That'll be probably the situation we're looking at. So NFL teams have to say to themselves, okay, no OTAs, no training camp. He's going to have to ease himself in. He'll start the season on the PUP if he comes into the 2020 draft. Mm-hmm. And are we willing to miss 6 games and have him go forward after that?
So he won't be 100% is what you're projecting sort of after he's drafted at whatever NFL camp he's in. So what linebacker needy team is sitting out there, months and months before the draft is going, man, I cannot believe this. Obviously, Alabama is hurting. What NFL team or teams do you think are hurting today?
Well, a couple teams come to mind. The Bucs actually spent their first 5 draft picks on defensive players. That's how bad they were. We talked about Devin White going 5th overall to them. You never have enough good inside linebackers. He makes some sense there. They already have Devin White, obviously, but another team that always comes to mind because they struggled defensively, the Oakland Raiders. The Oakland Raiders did a good job in the draft getting Cleveland Farrell at edge rusher, Jonathan Abram on the back end, their other first-round pick to play safety. Why not have someone in the middle that could do that? They signed Vontaze Burfict. He's not a long-term solution. Someone like Dylan Moses who could come in, not have to play immediately because of the injury, would make some sense in Oakland. And the team is also moving to Las Vegas, so one more piece of that puzzle to bring that team back to something other than what it has been recently, which is not a very good football team.
Yeah, as John Gruden said, it's hard to find someone to rush the passer, right? I mean, you don't just want to let those guys go away. You have to find them. It's hard to do. So you called Dylan Moses the best linebacker in college right now. He's out with the ACL. Who, looking further down your draft board, is number 1 as of today?
This is going to be interesting. Some guys are going to have to step up. A couple of names come to mind. Troy Dye out of Oregon. He's the guy to keep an eye on. But again, no one came into this season with quite the fanfare as Dylan Moses. There's Jacob Phillips out of LSU. We saw Shaquille Quarterman play the other night, had a pretty good game. So these are the names that we'll be watching going forward. Patty Fisher is another guy to watch. Tuf Borland at Ohio State. Again, these aren't Dylan Moses-type players. They have a chance to improve their draft stock, but no one that jumps off the page, jumps off the television screen at you when you watch them play, quite like Dylan Moses did.
All right, so some really tough news for Dylan Moses, but here's our Ryan Wilson saying maybe some optimism and some hope for his NFL future. Thanks, Ryan.